In Power Apps, there's currently no built-in control for selecting time, which can be a real challenge when you need users to easily pick hours and minutes. In this video, we'll solve that by building a custom time picker component from scratch. It's fully reusable, customizable, and perfect for apps that need precise time input without relying on clunky workarounds. Let's jump in and take a look. Channel members have access to download the apps used in the videos, as well as the YAML code used in the components that I showcase. You can click the join button below the video if you're interested in supporting the channel. We'll first take a look at some of the things that we have to keep in mind as we build this component. The first thing to keep in mind is that we need two different experiences for whether we're using 24-hour or 12-hour time. So in the case of 24 hours, we only need an hours and a minute selection, whereas with a 12-hour time, we need hours, minutes, and AM or PM. We'll control that through a custom property in this case. We also need the ability to set a default value, such as when we're getting the time from a record in our data source. We also want a display mode feature so that we can disable the component and not allow a selection under certain circumstances. We'll start by creating a new component named Time Picker. We'll just start by setting the width of this component to 250 and the height to 300. This will give us some space to work with, and we'll change this later on towards the end of creating our component. Let's go ahead and insert a vertical container into our component, and we'll name this container Time Picker. The layout gap for this container should be set to 2, and we'll set the padding on all sides to 2 as well. The width and height properties should be set to parent.width and parent.height, and that will make sure that our container takes up the whole space of the component. We'll also set the X and Y values to 0, and we'll disable the drop shadow. The first thing we'll do inside of our time picker container is insert a regular container named container time input. We'll set this container's alignment to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll disable the flexible height option and set the height to 32. The drop shadow for this container should be set to none. Inside this container, we'll insert a modern text input control, and we'll name this text time input. This control may be off-center inside of the container, so be sure to set the X and Y values to 0. We'll also go ahead and set the width of this text input control to parent.width. Next, we'll insert a button into our time input container, and we'll name this button show time picker. We'll set this button's layout to icon only, and we'll set the icon to the clock icon. We also want to set the width to 32 and the type to transparent. To position this button inside of our container, we'll set the Y property to 0. Now we also want the button to show up on the right side of the container, so we'll set the X property to parent.width minus self.width. And now we can see it positioned nicely on the right side of our time picker. In the onSelect property of this button, we'll set a variable called var show time picker, and we'll set this to the opposite of its current value. This will let us toggle the time picker's visibility. So far we have our display and our manual entry of the time, as well as our clock icon that will eventually show the time picker. Now we'll build the time picker part of this component. Inside our time picker container, we'll insert another vertical container, and we'll call this container time menu. We'll start align the container and set the width to 160 for now, and we'll disable the flexible height option and set the height to 240. The visible property of this container should be set to var show time picker, and we'll see that it disappears until we select our clock. Inside our time menu container, we'll need to insert two horizontal containers. We'll start with our first horizontal container, and we'll name this container times. The alignment for this container should be set to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll disable the flexible height option and set the height as 200. We also want to disable the drop shadow for this container. Again, we'll select our time menu container, and we'll insert a second horizontal container. The second one will be named container buttons. We'll set the justification of this container's contents to end justified, and we'll vertically align the container's contents as well. The left and right padding for this container should be set to 4, and the container's alignment should be set to stretch with a minimum width of 0. We'll go ahead and disable the flexible height option, and we'll set the height to 40. Inside our button container, we'll insert 2 buttons. The first button will be named Button Cancel, and the second button will be Button OK. For both of our buttons, we'll set the type to subtle and the font size to 12. For our Cancel button, we'll set the text to cancel and then the width to 64. For our OK button, we'll set the text to OK and we'll set the width to 40. Now both of these buttons will have some formulas added later, but for now we can set both of the onSelect properties of these buttons to set our var show time picker variable to false. In addition to the formulas we'll add later, these should close our time picker menu. Now let's start creating our time picker options. Inside our times container, we'll insert a vertical container named container hours. We'll set the vertical overflow to scroll and the alignment in the container to stretch with a minimum height of 0. We'll disable the flexible width property and set the width to 55. We also will set the drop shadow to none. Now inside this container, we'll insert a blank vertical gallery named gal hours. This will be our hours selector for our time picker. We'll center align this in the parent container and we'll set the width to 36. For this gallery's template size, we'll set this to 32, and we'll set the template padding to 2. For this height property of the container, we want the gallery to automatically adjust its height to display all the options inside of it. To do this, we'll disable the flexible height option, and we'll set the height to self.allitemsCount times the sum of our template height and our template padding. And to this, we'll add our template padding one more time. This will make sure that the gallery adjusts its height to accommodate all of the items inside it, and since the parent container is set to scroll, we can let it handle scrolling through the time options. Next, we'll disable the scroll bar, and then we'll go to the Advanced tab and set our loading spinner to loadingspinner.none. Inside of our gallery, we'll go ahead and insert a button control. This will be the button that the user interacts with in order to select the hour that they want. We'll need to set the button's width to 32, which it may appear like it is by default, but if we select the width property, we can actually see that in the formula bar it says 96. So just be sure to update that here. We also want to make sure that the X and Y values are set to 0, which in this case you can see it says there's 0 on the right-hand side, but if we select the property, it shows as a different value in the formula bar. We'll go ahead and name our button as well to Button Select Hours. Now before we do some formatting with the button, we'll need to set up the items of the gallery, and to do that we'll need to add a new custom property to our component. We'll select our component and add a new custom property. And for this property, we'll name it Time Format. This will be a data input of type number. We also want to make sure that we raise the on reset when the value changes. This time format property is going to determine whether we're using 12-hour or 24-hour time in our time picker. So for now, we'll set the default value of the time format to 12. Next, we'll go to the items property of our gallery, and we want to build our hours based on that time format custom property. So we'll use the sequence function pointed to our time picker component and then the time format property. We can see this creates a table with a single column called value, and this value column has rows counting up from 1 all the way to either 12 or 24, depending on the time format property. As a second argument to this sequence function, we'll check if the time picker property is set to 12 or 24. If our time format is 24, we want our sequence to start at hour 0. And if not, in the case that it's a 12-hour time format, then we should start our sequence at 1. Finally, we'll add a filter function to filter by our var show time picker variable. There's a bug with galleries right now where the height of the gallery item gets stuck and causes the item to just not appear at all. So setting the gallery to filter by this variable will make sure that the gallery's contents refresh when the time picker is made visible. With the items of the gallery set up, let's go back to our Select Hour button. And in the text property of the button, we'll use the text function pointed towards this item.value to display our hour value in the 2-digit format. So we can insert 2 zeros inside of quotes to represent that. On the Advanced tab, we'll go to the onSelect property, and instead of select parent, we'll set a variable called var hour, and that value will be this item.value. This will store the currently selected hour in a variable. Back on the Display tab, we'll go to the Type property, and here we'll check if this item.value is equal to var hour, then the type should be primary, and otherwise it should be subtle. If I select a button here, we can see that it's highlighted. Now that we have our hours part of the time picker complete, we'll copy our hours container and paste it inside of our times container. You'll notice we get an error when we try to copy and paste this, and our gallery turns black. This seems to be a bug right now in Power Apps, so if you experience this, just try saving your app and reloading it. Here we are back in our app, and we can see our new container with our copy of our gallery. This set of selectors is going to be based on the minutes, so we'll go through and rename our controls appropriately. With that done, we'll go to our gallery items, and right now this is displaying the number of hours to select from, and instead we want this to display minutes. We'll go to the items of our gallery, and in our sequence function, rather than creating a sequence from our time picker custom property, we'll create a sequence based on 60 divided by 5. Now the 5 in this case is our time interval that we want to show between each selection. So for our example, we'll have a time to choose every 5 minutes between 0 and 55. For our sequence function, we just want this to start at the number 0. So we'll replace our if function with 0. In front of our sequence function, we'll add a new formula for add columns. The column we want to add in this case is called minutes. And in our condition to add this column, we want to multiply the value column by 5. This will create a new column called minutes with a sequence of times every 5 minutes throughout the hour. And the value of those will be 5 times our sequence number. So in this case, our sequence is creating a single column table from 0 to 11, and our add columns function is multiplying that value by 5. In the select minutes button, now we need to change the display text to this item.minutes instead of this item.value. And now we can see our 5-minute time slots are displayed inside our gallery. We'll go to the Advanced tab, and instead of setting a variable called var hour, we'll change this to var minute. And the value of this minute should be equal to this item.minutes. Back on the Display tab, on the Type property, we'll check if this item.minutes is equal to var minute. Now if I select a minute, we can see it highlights that option. We'll go back to our gallery's items just to look at one more thing here. Say you wanted to change your minutes intervals to be every 15 minutes instead of every 5 minutes. We could replace the 5 in our items property with 15 in both of these spots. When we replace the 5 inside of our sequence function with 15, you can see we only have 4 time slots now for our minutes. And now we can see we have minute options for 0, 15, 30, and 45. We'll go ahead and leave this at 5 for our example today. Now we have one more gallery to create, and that's for our AM/PM selector. We'll copy our hours container again and paste it inside of our container times. Again, we receive an error and our gallery is black, so we'll go ahead and save our app and reload. Back inside of our app, you can see our new gallery and our new container are pasted, so we'll go ahead and rename these to AM/PM instead of hours. The width of our AM/PM container doesn't need to be as wide as the other two, since there's only going to be 2 options in this gallery and there won't be a scroll bar. So we'll go ahead and reduce the width of this container to 48. We'll go to our AM PM gallery now, and here we can replace the entire items property with a table containing two values, one for AM and one for PM. In our button to select AM or PM, we'll go to the onSelect property, and instead of setting var hour to this item.value, we'll set var AM PM to this item.value. In addition to that, we'll go to the type property, and instead of checking this item.value equal to var hour, we'll change this to equal var AM PM. We can test this out by selecting AM, and we can see it gets highlighted. Now if we select PM, it changes our selection. In terms of styling our containers, we'll go ahead and select our minutes container, and we'll set the drop shadow for this to light with a border radius of 0. With that, we can see a nice border between each of our three time selectors. The next thing we have to do is set our component to adjust the width of our time menu container based on the time format that's chosen. In the case of a 12-hour time format, we need some extra space to display this AM and PM selector. But in the case of a 24-hour time format, we don't need this extra space here, so our component can be smaller. For the visibility of our AM/PM container, we'll set this so that the container is only visible when our time format property is equal to 12. We'll select our times container, and here we'll insert a blank vertical container. And we'll name this container Container Times Auto Width. For this container's properties, we'll set the minimum height to 0, and we'll disable the flexible width option and set the width to 1. We'll also disable the drop shadow. This auto width container should mark the right side of our time menu regardless of whether the AM or PM selector is visible. So we can go to our time menu container and set the width of this container to container times auto width.x. When our AM and PM selector is not visible, the x value of our auto width container will move to the left, and with that, the entire container should be smaller. We can test this by going to our time format property and changing this to 24. Now you can see we only have the hours and the minutes. If we change it back to 12, our AM and PM selector comes back. Now we'll look at actually saving our time as we make a selection in our time picker. We essentially have three variables that we're working with, one for the hour, one for the minute, and if we're in the 12-hour time format, then the AM or PM selection. When the user clicks the OK button, we want to save the time value of the combination of these three variables to another variable. So before we hide our time picker, we'll enter another set function. For this set function, we want to set a variable called var selected time. And the value of this variable is going to be the result of the time function. The time function takes individual inputs such as the hour, the minute, and the second, and converts those into an actual time value. For our hour property, we want to check if our time format is equal to 12, and if our var hour variable is also equal to 12. If that's the case, then we want this value to be 0, and otherwise we'll enter var hour. Now we also want to add to this another if statement, checking again if our time format custom property is equal to 12 and our AM/PM selection is equal to PM, then we want to add 12 to this value. This formula is essentially used to convert our time in the case of a 12-hour time format to a 24-hour time format. You can think of this first if statement as our AM value. So if our selected hour is equal to 12 AM, then that would be converted to 0 in the 24-hour time format. Otherwise, we would keep whatever hour is selected. To convert this to a 24-hour time, we then have to check if our AM/PM selection is equal to PM. And if that's the case, then we have to add 12 hours to that value. So in the case of 12 p.m. or 12 noon being selected, the first value would be zeroed out, and then we would add 12 to that, since our AM/PM selection would be set to PM. If it's something like 7 a.m., this first part of the formula would return 7, And since the AM/PM selector would be set to AM, this value would return 0. So the overall value returned to our time formula would be 7. For the minute part of our time formula, we can simply insert var minute. And then for the seconds, we'll set this to 0. And our full formula is here. Again, when the user clicks OK, we're setting the var selected time variable to the hour and the minute that the user selected. This format checks if the hour is in the 12-hour time format. In the case of a 24-hour time format, this if statement would always default to the false result, which would set the value as var hour. So if the value is something like 23, then var hour will be set to 23. The second if statement in a 24-hour time format would return nothing, so the value would essentially only be set to var hour. Now if we make some time selections, we can click OK, and now our selected time variable should have a value. And we can see it's set to January 1st in 1970 with 5:05 a.m. as the time. 1/1/1970 is kind of the default value for dates that are provided in Power Apps. So this can be essentially treated as a blank date value. And we'll look at how to combine this with a date selection later on. Now that our variable is set, we also need to display this in our time input control. So we'll select the text time input control and we'll go to the value property. Here we want to use the text function to display our var selected time variable. And the format that we want to display it in is in the hour and minute format. To this, we also want to check if our time picker's time format property is equal to the 12-hour format. And if that's the case, then we want to display the AM or PM value. So if the time format is equal to true, we'll enter a space and then AM/PM. And we can already see a value populated in our text input control. If we select our clock icon, we can make a change here. Let's say we set this to 3:45 p.m. And when we click OK, our value is updated. Now our time picker is pretty much functioning at this point, but we have a couple things that we need to add via custom properties. We'll add a new custom property called auto height, and this will be a data output of type number. Now this auto height property is going to be pretty straightforward. We just want to check if var show time picker is set to true, and if so, the height of our component should be 278, or if not, then it can shrink down to 36. You can play around with these values as well, depending on how tall you want your time menu to be. You'll just have to adjust your time menu container to a new height. With that new custom property created, then we'll go to our height property for our component and set this to self.autoHeight. When our component is collapsed, we can see it shrinks accordingly. And if we expand it, now we can see our time picker. And as soon as we make a selection, we can see it closes. We'll add our next custom property now, and we'll call this one default. This is going to be the default selection for our time picker, which you can then feed in data from your data source. We'll keep this as a data input, but we'll change the type to date and time. And when this changes, we want to raise our on reset of the component. Now this default date and time property is going to fill in with this date time value, but we'll go ahead and add a time value function in front of this, and this will convert this date time format purely into a time value. The next custom property we'll add is one called value, and this will be a data output. For the type of this property, we'll also set this to date and time, and this will essentially be used to communicate the currently selected value to our app. When the user selects a value, we want our variable for the selected time to be accessible by our app. So here we'll change the default value to var selected time. For the next custom property, we'll add one for display mode, and this will be a data input of type text. We'll set the default value for this display mode property to displaymode.edit. And then for our time input and our show time picker button, we'll change the display mode property of this to our time picker component.displayMode. This way we can change our display mode to something like the view display mode from our app instead of having to modify the component directly. And this way you can have something like an edit button on the screen where you toggle the display mode of your component. We have one last custom property to create, and this one is called reset time. We'll set this property as an action type, and we'll add a new parameter for type. We'll leave this as text, and we'll make it required. And then we'll create our property. Now this reset time property is going to get a little bit complicated, but I'll do my best to explain it as we walk through it. The goal of this property is to essentially set our component to a state where var hour, var minute, and our var AM PM selection are all equal to the correct value with our var selected time. In the instance of first loading a screen where there might be a default value for this component, we need to set those variables up front so that the first time the user enters the component, they see the currently selected time values. Even though there's a default value, the values for var hour, var minute, and var AM PM selection would be blank. So we need a way to set those. We also have the instance where the user might make changes inside of the time picker, but then click the cancel button. And in that case, we need to reset the component to the state of the currently selected value instead of displaying what the user previously chose. Before we set up our reset time property, let's go ahead and define where this property is going to be called from. So the first place is in the onReset property of our component. Here we simply want to reference self.resetTime, and in the type parameter, we'll enter reset. This will tell us in the actual component property that the place the reset time action was called from occurred from the reset property of the component. The other two places are going to be on our cancel button and on our time clock. So for our cancel button, we'll go to the onSelect property and we'll enter a similar formula referencing our time picker component dot reset time. And for the type of this one, we'll enter cancel. This tells our action property that the action is being called from our cancel button. We'll copy this formula and we'll go to our icon for showing and hiding the time picker. And in the onSelect property of this, we'll paste in our copied code. And in this case, it's going to act the same as the cancel button, so we'll leave cancel as the type. Now we'll go to the actual reset time property. We'll go through and create the formulas here, and I'll explain as we go through, and then we'll do a recap at the end. The first thing we need to do is check if the type of the button that called this action property is of type reset. If that's the case, then we need to set our var selected time variable to self.default. This would be in the instance of our component loading for the first time, or if an external control like a button in our app resets our component, then it will set the var selected time to the default property of our component. After we've set the var selected time variable to the default value of the component, we need to check if the var selected time variable is blank. If it is blank, that means that there's no default selection and our time picker values should default to the very first value in the list. So in the case of a 24-hour time, the selected hour and minute should default to 0 and 0. Or in the case of 12-hour time, they should default to the first hour, the 0 minute, and the AM time. So if this variable is blank, we'll set var hour to the result of checking if the self.timeFormat property is equal to 24. And again, if that's the case, the hour should be 0. And if it's not, then we'll set the hour to 1. After this, we'll set our var minute. And in either case, this should be 0. Then we'll set var AM PM, and if self.timeFormat is equal to 12, then we'll set the value to AM. So this code will run if our var selected time variable is blank upon reset. If it's not blank, then we need to set our var hour as the hour from our selected time. But we need to do some checks to see if the time format is equal to 24 or 12. When we set var hour, we'll check if self.timeFormat is equal to 24. And if that's the case, we simply want the hour from the var selected time variable. If this is false, then we'll use the mod function to get the remainder from var selected time divided by 12. Next, we'll set var minute, and this will simply be set to the minute value of var selected time. Next is our var am/pm value, and here we'll check if self.time format is equal to 12. Then we want to set var am/pm to the resulting value from checking if the hour of our var selected time variable is greater than or equal to 12. And if it is, we want to set our value as PM. Otherwise, we'll set it as AM, and we'll close all our formulas. So now let's recap what our formula is doing. At the beginning, we're checking if the type parameter is equal to reset, which is the case if the component is being reset from the onReset property. Then we'll set the var selected time variable to the default property of the component. After that's done, we check if var selected time is blank. If it is blank, we'll set var hour to either 0 in the instance that our time format is equal to 24, or 1 if we're using the 12-hour time format. We'll also set var minute to 0, and var am/pm will be set to am if our time format is 12. In the case of var selected time not being blank, we want to set var hour to the selected time's hour in the case of 24-hour time, or to the remainder of the selected time's hour divided by 12 in the instance of 12-hour time. Then we want to set var minute to the minute of our var selected time variable. And then in the case of using the 12-hour time format, we want to set var am/pm to either PM in the instance of our hour of var selected time being greater than or equal to 12, or we want to set it to AM if the hour of our var selected time is less than 12. This really does seem like a lot of code for something so simple, but it's really needed to make the time picker behave in a way that the user would expect. And with that, our component is complete. We'll go back to our screen and we'll insert our component. We can see 12 AM is listed as our default value, which we can either keep or we could make our default value blank. We'll go ahead and select our clock icon, and we can see because our default value is blank, we have 1 AM selected by default, although it's not shown as our currently selected value. We'll make a selection here for 5:10 PM. And now we can see this is our selected value. We'll drag a text control onto our canvas, and we'll just check the output of our new component. We'll reference our time picker component .value, and you can see the output that we get is 1/1/1970 at 5:10 PM. Now, if you only wanted to output the time portion of this value, you could instead reference time value of time picker .value. Let's see how we can combine this time picker with a date picker. We'll go to Insert, and we'll insert a date picker. If we select a date from our date picker, we essentially want to combine the value from our time picker plus the date found in our date picker. So we can simply do this by referencing time value of our time picker component .value plus the date time value of date picker canvas 1 .selected date. And we can see the output here is our selected date plus our selected time from our time picker. We'll also look now at how we can use this in combination with a data source. We'll go ahead and insert a table control on screen. And for the items of this table, we'll set this to a collection of dates. This collection simply has 2 records and 2 dates. So what we can do now is select our time picker component, and we could set the default value as our currently selected record in our table. And we'll say that's our date property. We'll also copy this and set our default selected date for our date picker to the same thing. Now when we select a record, we can see that our time picker reflects the time from our table, and our date picker reflects the date. We'll go ahead and insert a button now to save our information to the table. So when this button is pressed, we want to patch our collection, and this could be any other data source. We'll patch our collection, and the record we want to patch is our selected item from our table. And in this case, we'll patch our date column with the time value of our time picker's currently selected value, plus the date time value from our selected date in our date picker. The reason we use the date time value here is because our selected date in the date picker actually includes the time from our table here. So we need to remove that because we don't want to add our other time from our time picker to our time that's already in the selected record. So with this date time value, we can see that it resets the time back to midnight and then adds our time from our time picker to the date. We'll go ahead and make a change here and then save our record. And we can see our record is updated appropriately. We'll try switching our time format to the 24-hour time, and we can see that our container adjusted accordingly. We'll go ahead and select one of our records here, and we can see our date shows as 2205. So we'll just change this to 2320, click OK, and now we can see our selection is saved. If we click our Save button to save this to our collection, we'll see it's now showing 11:20 p.m. We can test our display mode by switching this to display mode.view, and now we can see that our component doesn't allow us to make a selection or open the time picker. Now there's one more use case that we need to create inside of our component, and that's our ability to manually type a value into this time picker. If we type a value now, we can see that our selected value does not update. So that's what we need to add. If we go back to our time picker, we can go to our time input control, and in the onChange property of this control, we want to set var selected time to the time value of self.value. After this is done, we want to trigger the reset time function of our component. And in this case, we'll just pass in the cancel parameter since we don't want the component to reset var hour, var minute, and the AM PM to the default value. We instead just want them to be set to whatever the currently selected value is. We'll go back to our screen now and we'll select a record. And if we play our app, we can try changing this to 1055, for example. And when we click out of the text input, we can see our value updated to 1055. And if we open our time picker, we can see 1055 is selected. We'll go ahead and change this to something like 1015, and we can see the minute is now updated. The same goes for the hour, as well as the AM PM selection. Those update every time the text is changed. And that's really all there is to it. In this case, we're creating a component that gives the users times in an easily accessible fashion. And they're able to make a selection here and then save it back to the data source very easily. The design of this component should feel very similar to making a date selection since the design language between the two is very similar. Again, the only thing to watch out for when you're saving data back from this component is that you need to convert the value of the component to a time value and then add the date time value of your selected date to this value. So with that, I hope you found this video helpful and you're able to use this date picker in places where you previously would have used a number input to simply have the user type in their preferred time manually. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for future videos like this one. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on this component and whether you think we'll ever see an official time picker in Power Apps. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.